My daughter stood up at her own wedding reception in front of 200 guests and thanked everyone in that room, her new husband's parents, her college friends, her book club, the caterer, everyone except me. I sat at table 4 in the rented suit I'd worn to her high school graduation, and I smiled. I kept smiling the whole time she spoke. Because that's what I do. I keep my face still and my mouth shut, and I let people believe they've won. She didn't know what I knew. She didn't know what I owned. A week after the wedding, the management company that handled her boutique sent her a certified letter. Her lease was up for review. The building owner, a holding company she'd never heard of, was exercising a clause in her contract. She called me crying. I let the phone ring twice before I picked up. My name is Gerald. No, wait. Let me start over. My daughter has called me a lot of things over the years. Boring. Rigid. Financially illiterate. Those were her husband's words, but she repeated them often enough that they became hers too. At 63, I am a retired civil engineer who spent 34 years building things that outlasted me. Bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure no one notices until it's gone. I am not flashy. I drive a 2016 Nissan Pathfinder with 112,000 miles on it. I live alone in the same house I bought in 1991, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where the maples I planted in the backyard are now taller than the gutters. I am, according to my son-in-law, a man who peaked early and then got comfortable. He said that at Thanksgiving, not directly to me. He said it to my daughter, in the kitchen, in the kind of loud whisper people use when they want to be overheard. I was in the living room, watching the game with the sound down, and I heard every word. Your father's a smart guy, he said. I mean, for what he did, but he's not a builder. He's a maintainer. There's a difference. My daughter laughed. It was a small laugh, the kind that meant she agreed. I didn't say anything. I turned the volume up 2 notches and watched a quarterback scramble for a first down. Let me tell you about my son-in-law. His name is Derek. Derek, with a capital D and an ego to match. He grew up comfortable, went to a mid-tier business school on his parents' money, and came out the other end convinced he was the kind of man who recognized opportunity. He wasn't wrong, exactly. He had good instincts and a smooth way of talking that made investors feel like they were getting in on something. By the time he married my daughter, he'd already launched one company that sold for a modest sum and was working on a second, a lifestyle brand that made custom jewelry and sold it through a website that felt expensive. My daughter, for her part, had real talent. She'd always had an eye. She could walk into a thrift store and come out with something that looked like it belonged in a gallery. After she graduated, she opened a small vintage and handmade goods boutique in the Short North neighborhood, the kind of place that shouldn't work on paper but did. Because she worked it. She knew her customers. She knew her suppliers. She spent Saturdays at estate sales and Wednesday evenings handwriting thank you notes to regulars. The boutique was hers, or she believed it was. 3 years before the wedding, she'd come to me with a problem. Her landlord was selling the building. The new owner, some investment group she'd found online, was raising rents across the board. Her monthly cost would nearly double. She'd run the numbers. She couldn't make it work at the new rate. She was thinking about closing. I told her I couldn't help. I said my money was tied up. I said at my age, I was focused on preserving capital, not taking risks. She was disappointed. She told me, not unkindly, but with that particular tone she'd picked up from Derek, that maybe that was exactly the problem, that I'd spent my whole life being careful and cautious, and look where it had gotten me. A paid-off house in a zip code no one had heard of, and a pension that covered my bills. I nodded. I told her I understood. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent the previous 2 months working with my attorney to purchase the building through a limited liability company I'd set up for that purpose. The LLC was named after nothing she'd recognize, a string of initials derived from my mother's maiden name and my old work badge number. I'd been watching that block for 4 years. The building was undervalued, the location was rising, and I knew it before the seller did. The new management company we hired reached out to her shortly after the sale with a very specific offer. They explained that the new owner was interested in curating the tenants in the building, looking for local, authentic, independently owned businesses that reflected the neighborhood's character. They said they were willing to offer her a reduced, stabilized rent for an initial 3-year term in exchange for her commitment to the space. She signed without reading all of it. She called me that evening, almost giddy. "Dad, I got the best news," she said. The new building owner reached out. They actually want me there. They gave me a deal. "That's wonderful," I said. "It's incredible. I don't know who these people are, but they clearly understand what I'm doing there." "They probably do," I said. What she didn't read, or read and didn't remember, was the clause in paragraph 11 that made the reduced rate contingent on her continued operation of the business in good standing, and on the building owner's assessment of reputational alignment. That clause also gave the management company the right to initiate a lease review upon any material change in the business's financial structure or ownership. Her business's financial structure was about to change, because Derek had decided it was time to grow. I should explain what happened between the wedding and Thanksgiving, because the wedding was when things started to shift, and Thanksgiving was when I understood they had shifted past the point of return. The wedding itself was beautiful, if I'm honest. My daughter wore something she'd found at an estate sale in Bexley, ivory, 1940s, altered to fit, and she'd done the flowers herself with help from a friend who used to run a flower stand at the North Market. The venue was a restored warehouse. It was genuinely lovely. I'm not a sentimental man, but I cried during the ceremony and wasn't ashamed of it. The reception was where things went sideways. My daughter gave a speech. She thanked Derek's parents by name, Roderick and Pamela, who had arrived from their second home in Scottsdale looking tanned and gracious. She thanked the bridesmaids. She thanked the venue coordinator. She thanked, in a moment I still think about, Derek's older brother for flying in from Portland. She said, "I want to thank everyone who helped make this day possible, and who has supported us." And then she sat down. No name, no acknowledgement. Not even a general, and of course, my family. Derek's father caught my eye from across the room and gave me a look that I couldn't entirely read, something between sympathy and curiosity. Roderick was a retired federal judge. He and I had spoken maybe 4 times in total, but in that moment I think he understood more about what had just happened than I did. I didn't leave early. I had danced once with a cousin's wife who took pity on me. I ate the salmon, which was good. I drove home at 10:30 and sat in the kitchen for a while before I went to bed. The next morning, I called my attorney. Her name is Suzette. She's been my attorney for 19 years and the only person outside of my house who knows the full scope of what I'd put together over the past decade. We met for coffee at a diner we both like. The kind of place where the booths are cracked and the coffee is 25 years behind in terms of origin story, but always exactly right. I told her what had happened at the reception. She listened without interrupting, the way she always does. When I finished, she said, "Are we talking about contingency planning, or are we talking about activation?" I looked out the window at the parking lot. "Activation," I said. She nodded slowly. The way you nod when something you've prepared for a long time is finally becoming real. I'll pull the files. Here is what Suzette and I had built, quietly, over the better part of a decade. My daughter's boutique occupied a ground floor space in a building I owned through an LLC. The lease gave me, as the building owner, the right to initiate a review of her tenancy upon certain defined conditions. One of those conditions was a material change in her business structure. Derek had spent the better part of their engagement convincing my daughter that the boutique was too small, that she needed to scale, that her eye, which was genuinely exceptional, was being wasted on a single storefront in Columbus when it could be driving content, brand partnerships, product lines. He had a plan. He presented it to her on a slideshow at her kitchen table, and she'd called me the next day, excited. "Derek thinks we should restructure the boutique under his umbrella," she told me. "Make it a division of his brand. He says the cross-promotion alone would double our revenue." I asked if she'd spoken to a business attorney. She said Derek had his own team handling it. Of course he did. What happened over the 18 months between that phone call and the wedding was that my daughter slowly transferred operational control of her boutique to a joint venture entity Derek had structured. one in which his lifestyle brand held a 51% interest. She remained the creative director. Her name was still on the sign, but the business was no longer independently hers. The lease, however, remained in her name because Derek's attorney had missed the clause about material changes in financial structure. Suzette hadn't missed it. Suzette doesn't miss things. There was one more piece. Derek had been retained as a consultant by the management company, my management company, at my direction on a contract that paid him a monthly fee in exchange for market advisory services. The retainer was modest but steady. It had been Derek's suggestion. Actually, he'd reached out to the management company, not knowing who was behind it, to pitch his consulting services. Because that's what Derek does. He sees a professional contact, and he monetizes it. We'd accepted because having him on retainer meant we had a direct financial relationship with him that could be severed at will. He told my daughter about the contract like it was a victory. Even your building's management company recognizes what I bring, he said, apparently. She'd mentioned it offhandedly to me over the phone. Derek picked up a little consulting gig with the company that manages your building. Small world, I said. He's good at finding those opportunities, she said. There was pride in her voice. There was also, underneath it, the faint echo of a comparison she didn't make out loud. By the Monday after the wedding, Suzette had everything ready. The first move was the consulting contract. We sent Derek's company a notice of termination per the contract's standard 30-day clause. No explanation required. Clean, legal, final. The second move was a formal notification to my daughter, delivered through the management company, that a lease review had been initiated due to a material change in the business's ownership structure. The letter cited the relevant clause and requested documentation of the current ownership arrangement within 10 business days. The third move was a call I made myself, to Roderick, my son-in-law's father, the retired judge. Not to involve him, but to give him a warning, one father to another. I didn't explain everything. I just said, your son may be facing some professional turbulence in the next few weeks. I thought you should know. He was quiet for a moment. Does this have anything to do with the wedding speech? He asked. I said, it has everything to do with who my daughter became when she was with him. Roderick didn't respond to that, not directly. But before he hung up, he said, my wife said the same thing to me in the car on the way home. She said, that girl didn't even mention her father. The week after I made those calls was the quietest week I'd had in years. I went to the hardware store and bought supplies to fix the fence along the back of the property. I cooked real meals. Nothing impressive. A pot of chili, a pan of roasted vegetables, and ate them at the table instead of over the sink. I watched an old documentary about the construction of the Hoover Dam that I'd been meaning to get to for months. I slept well. My phone buzzed twice. I looked at it both times. The first time, it was my daughter. I watched her name on the screen until it stopped. The second time, it was Derek's number. I recognized it even though he'd only ever called me twice in his life. I didn't move to pick it up at all. On a Friday evening, 12 days after the wedding, my daughter arrived at my house without calling first. I heard the car in the driveway. I was on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the light change in the yard. I heard the front door. I left it unlocked, as I always do in the evenings, and then her footsteps through the hall. She pushed open the screen door to the porch. She had her hair pulled back and was wearing the kind of clothes she wore to work. A linen shirt, practical pants, and her face had the particular look of someone who'd been rehearsing a conversation for days and wasn't sure anymore if the rehearsal had helped. She sat in the other chair. For a minute, neither of us said anything. The yard was loud with cicadas. Was it you? She asked finally. Her voice was careful, not angry yet, just trying to confirm. Which part? I said. She turned to look at me. The building. I nodded once. Her jaw tightened. How long? 3 years. She exhaled. It wasn't quite a sound, more of a physical response like something settling. The management company, she said. The lease offer. Yes. The consulting contract with Derek. Yes. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the yard, at the maples. She crossed her arms. You let me think strangers saw my value, she said quietly. You let me believe some outside investor believed in what I was doing. You did the work, I said. I provided the stability. What you built in that space, that was yours. I didn't walk in there and arrange the displays or write the thank you notes or drive to those estate sales. You did. The value was real. But you were behind it the whole time. Behind it, not running it. She turned around. Why? Why do it this way? Why not just tell me? I set down my glass. Because if I'd told you, Derek would have found a way to make it about him. He would have restructured the deal. He would have put his name on the building before I could finish telling you the story. You know that. She didn't argue it. Which told me she knew it too. And the wedding, she said. It wasn't a question. The wedding was when I understood something had changed, that I couldn't ignore anymore. I forgot, she said. Her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. I was nervous, and I had too many things to say, and I got overwhelmed, and I had too many things to say, and I got overwhelmed, and I forgot. I know, I said. I know you didn't mean it as a statement, I said. But it was one, whether you meant it or not. She sat back down. She put her face in her hands for a moment, then lifted it. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. My daughter doesn't cry easily. She got that from me. My daughter doesn't cry easily. She got that from me. What happens now? She said. Now I'm going to show you something. I brought out the folder I'd had sitting on the kitchen table for 2 weeks, waiting. Inside was everything. The LLC documentation, the original lease, the ownership structure, the consulting contract. I'd also included, at Suzette's suggestion, a clean summary sheet that laid out the situation in plain numbers. I put it on the table between us. Your boutique, I said, is in a building I own. The lease is still in your name. The management company is mine. That consulting contract with your husband terminated 2 weeks ago. His fee was $1,200 a month, which meant that every month for the past 8 months, my money went from my holding company through the management company into his pocket. He was being paid by the man he called a guy who peaked early. She stared at the summary sheet. He doesn't know, she said slowly. He knows something changed. He doesn't know who's on the other end. She was quiet for a long moment. The lease review, she said. Are you actually going to? No, I said. Not if you want to keep the space. That was never the point. Then what was the point? I picked up my iced tea again. The point is that you need to know what you're standing on. You've been walking around for 2 years acting like Derek built the floor under your feet, and I needed you to understand that he didn't. I did. Not because I wanted credit. I never wanted credit, but because you looked at me across a dinner table and agreed without a word when he called me a man who played it safe and got comfortable. And you stood up at your own wedding and said thank you to everyone in the room except the person who made it possible for you to have a business to celebrate. She looked at the table. I owe you an apology, she said. You owe yourself an honest look at your situation, I said. The apology is secondary. We sat out there for another hour. I made a second glass of tea and brought her one without asking. The cicadas kept going. At some point, a bat started working the far edge of the yard, dipping and turning in the dark. She asked questions. I answered them. She asked about the original building purchase, about how the LLC was structured, about whether Derek could contest any of it. I told her Suzette had checked every angle, and there was nothing to contest. Everything was clean and legal, and had been since the beginning. At one point, she said, "You put a lot of work into this." "I've been putting work into things my whole career," I said. "The only difference is this one had your name on it." She left around 10. She hugged me at the door. A real hug, the kind she used to give me when she was young. Both arms. She didn't say anything. I didn't need her to. 3 weeks later, my son-in-law came to understand the full picture. It didn't come from me. I told my daughter everything, and I'd left it to her to decide how much to tell him and when. What I didn't anticipate, though maybe I should have, was that she'd sit him down at their kitchen table with the folder I'd given her and go through it page by page. She called me the morning after. He took it hard, she said. I imagine. He said you were manipulative. He said you set him up. He wasn't wrong about the setup, I said. He applied for that consulting contract himself. No one recruited him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he also said you're the most patient man he's ever come across. I took that as the only compliment that mattered. My son-in-law and I have not spoken directly since then. I don't know if we will. My daughter and I speak more than we have in 3 years. Real conversations, not the performative check-ins we'd been doing where she updated me on the business, and I said things like, "That's great, honey," and meant nothing, and she heard nothing. Last month, she drove out, and we spent a Saturday going through some boxes in the basement. Old stuff of her mother's that I'd never gotten around to sorting. She found a photograph of herself at maybe 7, sitting on a concrete form at a job site, wearing a yellow hard hat 4 sizes too big, laughing at something off to the left of the frame. She put it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. I remember that day, she said. Morrison Street overpass, I said. We were pouring the deck. You kept asking the crew chief how the rebar worked. She laughed. He was so patient with me. He liked you, I said. Said you asked better questions than half his new hires. She propped the photo against the fruit bowl, and we kept sorting boxes. I don't know what her marriage looks like now, from the inside. That's not my business. What I know is that she came to me last week about a new space, a corner location 2 blocks from the current boutique, bigger, with a loading dock that would work better for the vintage furniture pieces she's been wanting to carry. She wanted my opinion on the numbers. I read the proposal carefully, all of it, the way I read everything. Then I told her exactly what I thought, the way I always have. She listened. She asked follow-up questions. She pushed back on 2 points where she thought I was being too conservative, and she was right about one of them. We shook on it before she left. An actual handshake. Her idea, not mine. She said she wanted it to feel like a real partnership this time. I've been an engineer my whole life. I know what holds things up and what doesn't. I know the difference between a structure that looks solid from the outside and one that actually is. I spent 63 years building things quietly, checking the load tolerances, doing the math twice before I signed off. My son-in-law called that playing it safe. He said I'd peaked early and gotten comfortable. What he never understood, what I hope my daughter is beginning to understand, is that there's no such thing as a man who builds nothing. There are only men who build in ways you can see, and men who build in ways you can't. I happen to be the second kind. The maple in the far corner of my yard is 40 feet tall now. I planted it the year my daughter was born. In soil I amended myself because the drainage in that corner was poor. For the first 5 years, it looked like nothing, just a thin stake with a couple of leaves, the kind of thing you could walk past and not notice. My neighbor at the time asked me once why I'd bothered planting a tree so far back in the lot. I told him I wasn't planting it for now. He moved away years ago. The tree is still there.